You can hear me. Welcome on this ninth ESEH Environmental History Today seminar. It's already the ninth edition of our seminar series, and for the first time at last we go back to the Middle Ages and move a bit further in time. And we are very pleased that today we welcome Ellen Arnold from Ohio Wesleyan University, who will discuss her recent and present her recent research. Just to introduce Ellen, many of you will know her. She's still in Ohio, but from August she will move to Norway, where she will become Associate Professor of Pre-Modern Environmental History at the University of Stavanger. Ellen Arnold is the author of Negotiating the Landscape, Environment and Identity in the Medieval Ardennes region, which explored how the monks of the Benedictine Abbey of Stavelot-Malmedy interacted with their natural environment between the 7th and the 12th century. And she's currently working on a new book, which is provisionally, I can imagine, called Riverscapes Revisited, Environmental Meaning and Memory and Goal from 300 to 1100, which will put river narrative central stage. And I think she will introduce us further on this matter. As in previous sessions, Ellen will present her research for about 30 minutes, and this will be followed by a Q&A session in which we can ask questions and discuss with Ellen her work. The session will also be recorded, and the recording will be put on YouTube on our Environmental History Today YouTube channel, which gives an opportunity to reuse the session and the discussion later for all kind of uses. It's also sort of archive from the Corona year, as we will remember it. In the meanwhile, I think I can give the floor to Ellen, thanking her again for being here with us, and thanks to you all also for logging in and discussing Ellen's work. Please, Ellen, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. Hi, everybody. It's really nice to engage with people in the absence of our regular ESEH. I haven't been able to be live because of American scheduling. I haven't been able to be live at the other events, but I've caught up with them. And this has just been such a rich and diverse way for us to stay in some of these broader conversations that normally come out of the conference. So Tim, thank you so much for doing the work to put it on and host it. And thank you for giving me a chance to show off some medieval images and voices. Unlike some of the other talks that we've gotten to watch, this is, as Tim points out, from a work in progress. This is hopefully a book that will be published relatively soon, but COVID. So I'm seizing this opportunity to test out part of the final chapter of my book, which, as Tim pointed out, is called Riverscapes Revisited. And much like some of the most recent Environmental History Today talks, my approach and my project really foregrounds cultural history and narrative storytelling and memory. And I engage with literary and historical texts from around 300 to around 1100, with the final chapter of the book looking a bit in the future, in the 1200s, to look at the way that whole time period is remembered and recollected and reimagined by the subsequent generation. And this talk today is from my final chapter, and it examines a very specific material artifact as a way of looking at issues of hybridity and cultural memory and integration of mixed identities in a medieval Gaul, which is, I realize, a weird blanket term, but I'm going with it. So I want to start out just by emphasizing that this is a work in progress, and as such, until I know exactly which images I get to use, I have not yet pursued image rights. So bear in mind that this is a forum for scholarly conversation and not in any way a publication of these images. So I want to begin this presentation by introducing you to a stunning wooden ceiling. And Tim, can you nod if you see that? My screen?
I can see it, but it's not, yeah, now it's a presentation mode.
Okay. Oh, I know what I did. Okay, so I want to start today by sharing with all of you a simply stunning wooden ceiling that was excavated in the cathedral town of Metz at the end of the 19th century. This ceiling, which is often called the Bestiary Ceiling, is on display at the Musée de la Cour d'Or, and it is one of the two oldest surviving decorated medieval ceilings in Europe. It has been dated dendrochronologically to the mid-1200s. I first encountered this ceiling while on a trip to Metz with two of my students who were researching Gallo-Roman museums in the Rhine and the Mosel. And we went to the museum to see the early medieval collection. And as my students would, I'm sure, attest, I had absolutely no idea that this ceiling was on display, or in fact, even that the ceiling existed. And it literally stopped me in my tracks. The images from this ceiling are no longer vibrant with colors, but they still radiate artistic energy. They are shockingly well preserved, and yet, as the museum itself points out, also shockingly understudied. Each of the framed images is about 1 square meter. And there are about 70 square meters of painting ceiling that survive out of an estimated original 90 square meters. The panels are believed to have filled 2 neighboring rooms with 2 distinct collections of images. The first room alternated circular and square frames, and the second room had slightly larger circular frames around all of the images. The surviving images are rather remarkable. There are no narrative scenes, no saints or angels, and only 2 unambiguously human figures. Instead, the ceiling represents a remarkable number of animals and fish, real and imagined, monsters, mermaids, and other often startling human and fish hybrids. Some of the panels portray individual fish and real water creatures, such as this panel that contains a fish that simply must be a flounder next to a crab. Others contain hybrid animals, neither fish nor fowl, and in fact there is one fish fowl. Animal hybrids of other wondrous beasts, like these side-by-side elephant fish, coexist with human fish hybrids like this pair that includes a monkfish. It's hard for me to convey just how fishy this ceiling is. Of the 80 surviving full panels, 29 of them represent some sort of fish, water creature, or fish hybrid. Here is a revising of the layout of the ceiling that I've done with where I've numbered them, and all of the blue panels contain one of these water creatures. Many of the hybrid animals on the ceiling are also non-standard, including ones that may well have been dreamed up by the patron or painter of this ceiling. The bulk of the hybrids are composed of fish, blended with other animals and even humans. There is a wolf fish, a stag fish, a unicorn fish, a horse fish, the rather cute duck fish that I just showed you, the monk fish, a cat fish, and of course those elephant fishes. I count 29 of these aquatic creatures and watery hybrids, which primarily occur on the ceiling in clusters, increasing the visual sense that they dominate the ceiling. In addition to the fish panels, there are many birds, bipeds, and by this it includes a mix of bird, animal, human hybrids, monstrous humans, large cats and cat hybrids, and even a panel depicting multiple human faces arranged in a roseate pattern. So it's inarguable that the contemporary bestiary craze of the mid-1200s must have influenced the ceiling makers. We don't know anything about who they were. All we know is that the building was located in the vicinity of the cathedral, and so may have belonged to canons or else wealthy elite from the town. But the ceiling makers seem to have been aware of bestiaries, that in the ways that they are full of marvelous animals and hybrids. And there's a comparative example from the Harley Bestiary that similarly imagines a range of fish terrestrial animal hybrids. And this is the image in this bestiary that accompanies the text on fish. To date, there is actually only one substantial work on the Metz ceiling by Jérôme Fronty. Fronty attempts to trace the origins and inspirations of the images. He alights naturally on the medieval bestiaries and on the literary and scientific works that inspired them, such as the Physiologus and Isidore of Seville. He does a remarkably thorough job of finding the textual links between the ceiling and the bestiaries and other encyclopedic works available and popular by 1250, including one called L'Image du Monde by Gautier of Metz, written contemporaneously with the production of the ceiling. But most bestiaries give very little attention to fish. If this were just a bestiary ceiling, the balance of fish and other animals would look very different. And so I think there's a deeper story here, a further reason for the incredible fishiness of this ceiling. The ceiling, preserved by chance, captures a moment and an artist drawing not just on the bestiary craze, but also on centuries of other images and stories about medieval rivers as sites of hybridity. My first reaction on seeing this ceiling was that I had never seen anything quite like it. But on further reflection, though remarkable, it's not unprecedented or unimaginable, given the prevalence of hybrid animals in medieval and Gallo-Roman art. The artisans of Metz would not have had to look far for similar hybrid and imaginary animals. Legends about St. Clement, the Bishop of Metz, included the monstrous hybrid eventually known as the Graioui, a dragon that allegedly lived in the Roman amphitheater. This creature bridged antiquity and the medieval and still connects past and present today in modern Metz. Though hybrid images clearly coincided with the creation of the Metz ceiling, they also predated them. These images did not exist in a vacuum, and they're part of a dialogue about identity and hybridity that was present from at least late antiquity. Gallo-Roman art and its medieval heirs were filled with fantastical hybrids: Capricorns, sirens, Melusines, mare people, and dragon-like sea creatures. These fish on the ceiling at Metz grow not only out of bestiaries, but also out of Gallo-Roman fish floors, out of early medieval legends, and out of the encyclopedism of 12th and 13th century European cathedral towns. The Metz cathedral that currently stands was begun in 1240 and was constructed until 1551. The ceiling hybrids from Metz are tied to Gallo-Roman sea creatures, to early medieval ideas about hybrid identities, and to conversations about many kinds of barrier crossing in and around water. The hybrid animals that converge on the Rhine and the Mosel in the art and literature of the early Middle Ages seem to blur pagan and Christian contexts, blur species borders, and blur boundaries between secular and spiritual knowledge, and between folklore and book learning. A moment in this story of hybridity that would have been known to the Metz artist who painted the ceiling is found in the story of St. Clement of Metz and the Grailloux. The first written testament of this legend that would be important for over a millennium is in Paul the Deacon's 8th century recounting of Clement's episcopacy as part of the Histories of the Bishops of Metz. Paul notes that one of the first things the saint did upon arriving at Metz, located on the very bank of the Mosel River, was to build a Christian oratory within the caves of the amphitheater and to drive away the sordid cults of the idols. Paul explains that those who have knowledge of this place assert that, down to the present day, circa 800, no snake was able to stay, and harmful plagues absolutely flee from the place. An interpolation of Paul's Clement story was written around the year 1000 and is included in all but one of the surviving manuscripts of Paul's history. This additional content explains the full danger the snakes had posed. When Clement arrived, this anonymous unknown author points out, a plague was raging, and the amphitheater was then so full of serpents that nobody dared to visit or even to come near the place. Their venomous breath cruelly killed not only human beings, but also horses, oxen, cattle, and other animals. The poisonous gases of the serpents caused plague, and at the instigation of the slippery serpent, the interpolator explains, Clement went with other monks and fearlessly approached the caves of the amphitheater in order to fight the old serpent, that is, the devil. The serpents all rushed towards Clement. He bound up the largest of the serpents in the garment he was wearing on his holy throat, his episcopal stole, and before the eyes of all the people, he brought the largest of the serpents to the river Say, which runs nearby, and released it. He banished all of the snakes to inhabit those regions where no human residence is possible. As Damien Kemp points out, this interpolation focuses on augmenting the myth about the driving out of the serpents and seems to have merged local lore with stories of St. Martial. The account works to tie Clement more closely with the abbey near the former amphitheater in an effort to keep the saint's body from being translated to the Metz cathedral by the bishop. This effort seems to have also produced the first standalone Vita of St. Clement, which was also written around the year 1000. It's a poetic expansion of the story in which Clement comes to Metz and as part of his missionary work frees the city from serpents by leading the largest one away using the stola as a leash. Subduing the enemy, Clement then leads it out of the city limits, whereupon all of the other snakes gathered together in a malignant cohort follow their leader into the rushing river. Though the first surviving versions do not describe this beast's form or name it, over the course of the medieval and early modern tellings, it becomes a dragon. This monster, associated quite closely with the river, would have been a cultural story accessible and possibly important to the ceiling painter. Magdalena Lanushka points out the connection of Clement's Grailloux to the later medieval legend of St. Romanus, in which the dragon gargoyle Gargouille was bested by the Bishop of Rouen and driven into the Seine. According to Daniel Ogden, the modern name Grailloux first appeared in the Metz context in 1546 as Gruelen. Clement and his dragon seem to have been constructed out of historical imagination, religious storytelling, and a deep connection between stories of rivers, conversion, and hybrids. In his book on the process of monastic remembering and forgetting, Phantoms of Remembrance, Patrick Geary includes a chapter on memory, the apocalypse, and a monk named Arnold who saw a dragon. Geary uses this as but one example of the ways that medieval hagiography and historiography are filled with visions, dreams, miracles, and other extraordinary experiences, and that the authors of these works were motivated to record them by the desire to transmit these extraordinary occurrences to posterity. Now, as much as in other parts of my work, I really emphasize how important it is that much hagiography includes a focus on the mundane. Dragons, miracles, and the marvelous often outlived the more mundane worlds that those same works recorded and that their authors lived in. Human actors disappeared, were forgotten, were displaced. As Peregrine Horton has pointed out, sometimes the dragons in medieval legend become more real and more meaningful than the forgotten bishops who fought them. Clement's dragon has become a more concrete part of Metz's history than the bishop has. Local lore has it that ever since the 12th century, residents of Metz have processed with an effigy of the Grailloux through the streets of the city from the cathedral down to the Seine. A 16th century version of this effigy is on display in the cathedral's crypt. The ritual continued throughout the early modern era up until recent history. By the 18th century, bakers fed loaves of bread to the effigy as it passed by, as did small children to avoid being eaten by the monster. This was at the core of civic ritual, and in several depictions of both the procession and Clement's original expulsion of the dragon have been represented in art over the years. Here are the two surviving versions from the Metz Cathedral, but again, given the long construction history of this cathedral, it's unclear when, and renovation and restoration history, it's unclear the dating on these particular representations of Clement and the Grailloux. Here's a 14th century life of Clement that features the stola, but also the caves of the amphitheater in a very compelling way. And here is a romantic version of the ruins of the amphitheater in the desolate forest with the Grailloux emerging. This has remained a vibrant theme in the reimagining of art and Metz's post-Roman identity. This procession was also mentioned by Rabelais, who pointed out the connection between these traditions and those surrounding the Mâche Croûte of Lyon, which he described as a monstrous and hideous effigy, terrible to little children, with a pair of wide and frightful jaws, which they made to rattle dreadfully one against the other, as they do at Metz with the dragon of St. Clement. Arles, too, has a legendary dragon, the Tarasque, who appears in the Golden Legend, a famous medieval collection of hagiography. Since the late 15th century, a festival has marked this creature, now held annually on the feast of St. Martha, who legendarily drove the beast away. In 2007, at the request of the mayor of Metz, the city's opera company built a modern statue of the Grailloux to hang in the Rue Taizon, part of the city's pedestrian zone. After more than a decade as a mascot of the city, the monstrous effigy, it weighs over 350 kilograms, was taken down to undergo a campaign of restoration. The monster still matters for Metz, But as the author of an article on the statue's restoration points out, 18 centuries later, the Catholic legend has morphed into a commercial mascot. Perhaps as a counter, the Metz Cathedral Light Show has reclaimed the Graillouis as part of its heritage and history in a striking visual display. And if you get a chance to see any of these cathedral light shows in Europe, they're a new emerging art form. They're fantastic displays of history and imagination. But the painters of the ceiling might have had other examples in mind as well as the Graillouis. There are other artistic predecessors, including ones that imagine a grid full of animals and other representations bounded off from one another, which may represent indirect forebears and connections to the Metz ceiling. The Metz ceiling is part of a longer tradition of domestic decoration in the Gallic world. Mosaic floors and painted walls and ceilings were part of the villa culture of late antiquity. Several surviving examples bear some meaningful similarities to the Metz ceiling, which, though not in any way a case of direct transmission, suggest a swirl of exemplars that make this ceiling part of a dialogue about how to present animalian and Piscean diversity and the ubiquity of decorative hybrids. The Metz ceiling, and here's just a visual reminder of its layout and overall impression, can be compared to a famous example of a painted gridded ceiling from the Mosel region. Also from the Mosel. The late 4th century frescoed ceiling, now at the Bischöfliches Dom und Diözesan Museum Trier, was also an accidental discovery accompanying an archaeological dig. It was found in 1945. It once adorned a palace that was demolished during the 4th century building of the first cathedral at Trier and may have belonged to Constantine's wife. The ceiling is made up of an astounding 30,000 fragments of plaster, painstakingly reconstructed to reveal this grid of 15 squares designed to look like those from a coffered ceiling. The squares contain portraits of 4 women, 3 philosophers, and 7 pairs of winged putti. Though this Treveran ceiling had been demolished in the 4th century, it's likely that the 6th century poet, Venantius Fortunatus, who wrote about Trier and other parts of the southern Gallic landscape, had seen intact Roman floor mosaics. And he definitely saw an elaborately painted ceiling in Bordeaux, at least one of which was full of animals, which he describes in a poem about the church of St. Bibianus in Bordeaux, built by Bishop Leontius in the 5th century. He describes how a paneled ceiling of novel and ingenious construction lends luster. You'd think here the artist had brought wild animals to life. The many intricate and artful floor mosaics that filled Gallo-Roman villas frequently highlighted the beauty, bounty, and even fearsomeness of the natural world. A concrete example of this, realize that's probably bad for talking about buildings. A specific example of this is the mosaic floor excavated at Saint Romain in Gaul near Vienne. The floor dates to the late 3rd century and originally was a grid of 40 images set inside squares. 27 survive, depicting the 4 seasons, puttis riding a range of animals, agricultural labor, rural festivals, and religious celebrations. But what about the fish? A late Roman villa of Montcarrat in the Dordogne was active from the 1st through the 5th centuries. When it was abandoned, a church was built in its place out of the fabric of the villa. The Christian artisans would have seen the many decorative features of the villa, including a bathhouse with this elaborate mosaic floor. It is excavated immediately in front of the church, leaving wide open the possibility that not only were the artisans aware of it, but that for a time they may well have left it visible in the earliest decades of the church's operation because of the importance of fish to Christian art and identity. This mosaic is a 4x4 grid that closely resembles the faux coffered ceilings found elsewhere in late Roman art. Each panel is bounded in yellow and red squares and contains aquatic creatures, fish, jellyfish, squid, and shellfish that would have all been visible underneath a rippling layer of water. So these late antique comparanda are suggestive of a wider set of artistic forebears for the Metz ceiling. But there is one much more chronologically and thematically close, and that is from the ceiling of a church in Zillis, Switzerland. The Zillis ceiling is painted wood and dates from the early 12th century. So it is the partner of the Metz ceiling in being the two oldest extant ceilings. This one is actually still located in situ. And so this photo of the complete ceiling gives us an impression of the way the Metz ceiling might have looked when it was still intact. It was recently restored in the hopes that it can stay in place for longer instead of being taken down and housed in a museum. This ceiling has 153 images. Many of these are narrative and represent biblical scenes, but there is also an outer ring of monsters and marvels that include an elephant fish, a monkfish, and a birdfish hybrid. So ceilings and floors are one potential source of inspiration for the Metz ceiling. Another group of images that may have also been in the mind of the Metz ceiling painter or the patron are manuscript images of Noah's Ark, some of which combine the gridded pattern with an interest in representing the diversity of the animal world. For example, this late 13th century, from 1294, manuscript of the Somme le Roi, it contains a quarter-page illustration of Noah's Ark in which individual animals appear as disembodied heads in a grid of spaces. Noah, his family, and St. Mark's Evangelist hybrid, which is a winged cow, appear. I argue in another chapter of the book that the story of Noah and the covenant seems to have been part of the swirl of water-based stories that circulated through central medieval Gaul. And it would thus not be surprising if the artist or commissioner of the Metz ceiling had considered these images when designing their work. The Ark appears in many manuscripts, including ones that contain monsters and hybrids more broadly. An illustration from a copy of Beatus of Libana's Commentary on the Apocalypse also presents the Ark as a grid of coffer-like squares filled with animals. This particular manuscript is a 12th century Spanish copy of this 8th century religious treatise, again reminding us of the ways in which stories and art and representations blur across these medieval centuries. In this, the Ark has been abstracted completely to a grid containing either symbols, pairs of animals, or pairs of imaginary or legendary creatures. The presence of such creatures as griffins, unicorns, and bird-human hybrids leaves open the possibility for medieval readers, as do the bestiaries, that some of the monsters and marvels being increasingly represented in the works of the 12th century had survived the deluge to continue to inhabit the modern world. Like mosaics, whose individual tiles add up to greater wholes, which are tessellated and fragmented from inception, the Metz ceiling draws on fragments and figments, bits and pieces of the natural and supernatural worlds. It reconfigures them, often uniquely, drawing in centuries of legend, lore, and artistic forebears. I think that what we see with the Metz ceiling is an educated, artistically literate approach to the 12th and 13th century interest in presenting all of the world, real and imagined. The artist of the Metz ceiling was responding to more than just bestiary manuscripts and encyclopedic literature, however. As a resident of a riverside city and part of a culture that had long linked rivers with hybrid identities and the blurring of borders between land and water, German and Roman, Christian and pagan, and even the natural and the supernatural, the Metz artist was primed to depict the bounty and the beauty and the weirdness of creation as a ceiling full of hybrid fish. Thank you so much for letting me share this random and strange mix of images and ideas. I've got on this screen my personal email because I'm in this stage of transition. I don't yet know what my next email will be, but I also want to thank the Rachel Carson Center and my current institution of Ohio Wesleyan for help in funding this research and getting me to Metz, and for the University of Stavanger for supporting its future.
Thank you so much, Alan, for being our guide this evening into the mysterious environmental imagination of the Middle Ages, which also is a story which connects to so many important debates on continuity and change between antiquity and the Middle Ages, on the domestication of nature, on the Christian versus the pagan world, and their views on nature, on the cultivated and the wild nature, the imagined and the real, and so on and so on. So thanks very much for presenting this material and so many beautiful images, many of which I didn't know. It was real surprises to me also. As a medievalist, I must admit that I didn't know many of them, so thanks for that. And now it's time for questions and discussion. I don't know, you can either raise your hand, use the chat, have a go. Who has a question for Alan?
I'll start by saying, Tim, don't feel bad. Like, I had never even heard of this ceiling until I accidentally walked in the room that it was in. It's such a well-kept secret, and it's so stunning. But it doesn't fit all of our expectations of what medieval art is. And so it doesn't make it into like the mainstream conversations.
Oh, it's not in the major textbooks. Anyway. Are there any questions? Perhaps to start the discussion, I was wondering, Alan, how important the context of Metz was in your story. So Metz, a city which I know from the Moselle River. It's and the Moselle, in my imagination, it's not the most fearful of European rivers. It's a rather quiet river. Although I did hear a story about winter floods, which could be quite devastating. But is the Moselle and the context of the river Metz important for your story?
So this has been a hard book to write and assemble because I'm drawing from such a wide range of narrative sources that span this entire region. And so there's very few things that are dominant. So Metz appears. This is the place where it's the most highlighted, but it appears throughout the book. So there's very few places, unlike the first book that focused so heavily on Stavola-Malmedy. This one is much more about shared communication of ideas. And so there's not a lot of central places except the Mosel. One of the really fascinating things, and there's lots of reasons for this, one of which is the proliferation of monastic houses. The Mosel is incredibly dominant in the early medieval literature, more than the Rhine, more than the Seine. It really jumps out as a place about which lots of medieval people were reading and talking and telling stories. And part of that, as with all early medieval conversations, part of that is simply a product of where the people who were writing things were based and where those things, where the stories survived from. But it appears to have been a really key part of the early medieval environmental imagination. But Metz shows up. Trier shows up a lot. Bordeaux.
You don't think that Bishop Clement and his beasts are connected, are based on a sort of local narrative connected to the Moselle? It's more the regional or even supra-regional narrative which matters.
Yeah, one of the scholars who's working on Clement points out that Clement is one of these extraordinary examples of just how much imagination you can use when you, even as a medieval person, know nothing about the subject of the Vita. Mm-hmm. He's really a blank surface. He gets to be this kind of St. George style figure that, like many of the early medieval bishops, just kind of becomes semi-legendary prototype of what good bishops do. The very little is known about him. Okay, we think he was real. We think he was real, but
it didn't matter.
Yeah.
There is a question from Alex Cooper. Alex, have a go.
Hi, let me see. I'm an early modernist, not a medievalist, so I'm afraid my knowledge of all of this is really extremely limited. I mean, I'm just so fascinated by the existence of all of these grids of monsters. I think as an early modernist, I'm sort of used to thinking that grids are all the result of, Cartesian rationalization, or I mean, not actually thinking this, but maybe being told this. And so I just love all of these grids of images there. I guess my right. So I guess I actually have two sort of minor questions. The first is just, are there what other grids, whether of animals or not? You gave some great examples of other grids of animals, but I'm curious as to whether there were grids of plants. I work on history of natural history, or grids of any other kinds of things during the Middle Ages. So that's one minor question. Sorry, I've ended up realizing I have two minor questions. And the second is sort of more, I guess, just a thought as opposed to, I mean, I can't help but sort of link these amazing images of essentially monsters, hybrids that you have here with, again, being an early modernist, all of the monsters that started, well, maybe they were there all along on maps. I'm sure they actually were there all along, but during, of course, the Renaissance and era, these sea monsters that started appearing on all sorts of world maps and so forth. I wonder whether in your book you could have a tiny, or like just a paragraph in your epilogue or whatever. If you
like the ones behind Tim right now.
About the, right, I hadn't even noticed, but yes. So about sort of the survival of monsters, except perhaps instead of river monsters, they've become sea monsters.
And I think that they are sea monsters early too, right? There's and in fact, there's a really famous early medieval story that is half legend, half smear campaign, that the founder of the Merovingian dynasty was a sea monster. And so Merovec, and so there's these ways that the sea monsters actually come out of the Mediterranean and come out of pre-Christian, proto-Christian storytelling, and the bishops get brought in as a way to kind of Christianize those older stories. We're used to, because I think of the prominence of those early modern maps, and there's very few early medieval maps. It's just not an art form that existed and survived. The big craze of medieval world maps picks up right around the time of the bestiaries, right in the 1200s. But we are so accustomed to these stories coming out of these sea maps that we think of them as sea creatures. And I think part of my argument is that they're river monsters too, that it's not just about the coast and the shore. It's not just about the dangerous unknown ocean that holds monsters and marvels. It's also the places that we think of as more mundane also hold these monsters and these questions and these mysteries. The plant grid, I haven't done an exhaustive search on grids. That's part of the weirdness of this book, is I'm sort of like dabbling in a whole bunch of stuff, trying to draw these connections in. But one of the other things I examine in this book, in this chapter, besides the Metz ceiling, is my favorite medieval manuscript, which comes out of Belgium, the Liber Floridus, which is self-authored. The autograph manuscript of this encyclopedia still exists, and it dates from around the same time as this ceiling, actually. And in it, he has a number of pages that include grids, like 4x4s of plants. So it is this way that people are increasingly trying to kind of like box in and define and shape and understand this incredibly complicated natural world. I don't think it's Cartesian in that same early modern sense, but it's definitely part of this project of how do we start to put limits around our knowledge? How do we categorize knowledge? Oh.
Thanks so much.
Oh, thanks, Tim. Yes, my favorite medieval book, totally.
Yeah, me too. There is another question by Anastasia Lokteva. Anastasia.
Hey, hi. I think it's not really a question, but just I wanted to thank the author because, you know, my research is dedicated to animals in 19th century Russia and especially in cities. And, you know, I have even photos of them. But I'm really delighted how you treat those image sources, how you work with those images. And this is very inspiring for me when I have even the photos. I can see how much I can do with my sources. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you. And in this, I must admit that I am deeply inspired by the works of modernists. Right. Like, I think that the people doing early modern and modern cultural environmental history, where they spend so much time unpacking these issues of representation and the power of images to reshape our understanding of nature, like I really draw on the work of all modern people. So
yes, absolutely. So because, you know, when I discovered that I have some photos which are similar to of the breeds of animals, types of animals which are similar to the paintings which I study, I just try to study some differences. Are there any differences? Because they actually are. And as for this 19th century, is very interesting because the photography just emerged and we can use it. So thank you very much for your work with images.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Next question is from Will Cavert.
Hi, Will.
Hello. Hi, Ellen.
Oh, can't hear you.
Oh, can you hear me?
Just speak a little louder.
Oh, okay, sorry. How's that? Better?
Yep.
Okay. Good morning, since I'm also in the Midwest along with you. So I thought this was fascinating and fantastic. Thank you. I was thinking about a kind of tension in the presentation between sort of Mosel's, the Mosel region and Metz's kind of immediate material location and immediate reality as a river city, as a place with presumably significant river trade and far-flung contacts and merchants who travel along the river and people who catch fish from the river and bring in fish from further afield and so on. So there's a sort of claim that this has to be understood in its immediate material, maybe economic, context, but then also a lot of what you said was sort of free-floating imaginary kind of
you caught me.
What's that?
You caught me.
Yeah. So I mean, I don't know what else you're supposed to do other than that. But I mean, you know, the kind of contextualization with these other early medieval images, which was great, sort of takes it away from that immediate local context. So I guess my question is, how, like, what could you do with Metz and its context? What can you know about it? For example, I mean, it seems to me that, like, if you're saying this is a river city, people live on the river, they think about the river all the time, that's one kind of contextual argument. But it might also be, it probably is also the case that most of their calories don't come from the river, they come from like the countryside, from the agrarian world of everything that's not the river. Probably most of the income of the people that live in the river are, you know, agricultural rents and so on. So, you know, and I'm guessing, I know nothing about this. I'm also not a medievalist, of course. So my question is, what kind of mileage would there be, and what might it look like to kind of focus more on the context of Metz and the moment when this is being produced? Or can you just not do that?
Richard is grinning. I could potentially do that. But yes, I could potentially do that. I would have to figure out a lot more about the people currently working on the archaeology of Metz. I think that were I doing this as a standalone piece, that I would have to foreground that a lot more. Part of the reason it's not in it the way I presented it is that it's sort of the last chunk of the argument, and a lot of that, what people do on rivers in their daily lives, comes much earlier in the book. So I guess I'm in some ways forgetting that as this audience that I haven't primed you for that sense of the degree to which these medieval river towns were really engaged with their rivers. But I think so I think a greater attention to what Metz itself actually looked like would be useful in that context of what does it mean to the owners of this building that they are a river town. What does it mean that there are fish in the marketplace? Like those early modern artistic paintings of like the fish markets overflowing with the real abundance of the rivers and the sea. What's it mean that in that world of real fish abundance that this artist makes up fake fish? There's something that's niggling the back of my head now about the point that you made about so much of Metz's wealth coming from the agricultural hinterlands, which is a super good point. And that's especially where the cathedral and church money comes from. That is making me now think about how many of these hybrids are actually domestic agricultural hybrids. Like there's a goatfish and a horsefish and a cowfish and a duckfish. You know, like suddenly part of my mind's going, huh, these are not all wild animals hybrids, right? These are domestic animal hybrids as well. That may be part of that, but I think that Metz, this ceiling, the Graiui is pretty specific, the hybrid Graiui, and I think there's two images on the ceiling that are the Graiui. But the hybridity, I think, actually could be anywhere along the Mosel or the Rhine. And the Roman German museums in Trier and in Cologne and the one in Metz, they're all full. They're chock full of hybrid images. So I think that in some ways that dancing between the specificity of the fact that this ceiling was in fact built in Metz and there is this legend in Metz of this particular hybrid monster. But as I mentioned, as I mentioned early on, it's also a hybrid. It's a legend that exists all around the Gallo-Roman world with different bishop names attached to it. And so in some ways, the ceiling doesn't have to be in Metz. It has to be in an early medieval river town. And so I think that's part of maybe what I need to work on articulating better. That this is, it exists in Metz, but it something like this could well have existed in Trier or in Cologne or in Bordeaux as well. So does that make sense?
Perfect, thank you. I think we have 5 or 10 minutes left, so please, Alex, if you have another question.
I was just going to say, Richard, you're totally right. Like a material comparison of Metz and Trier for like these 6 centuries would be absolutely fascinating. And maybe honestly, the kind of project that I can start to do now that I'm moving into a context where conversations with the people who work in these places are going to be much more feasible. But
right, my question was just another very minor one. Namely, I'm just wondering, since most of the examples, and this is probably related to your own background, that you gave of this kind of phenomenon are from areas that we might nowadays call France and Germany. But are there examples of this kind of phenomenon from, say, places more around the Mediterranean, or is this something that's geographically restricted or home to certain kinds of, pagan and Christian settings, or?
There are lots and lots of books on medieval dragons that kind of make that big universalizing claim. And in fact, Peregrine Horden, who I cited about talking about how bishops may be less real than dragons, his work is on Italy largely and the Mediterranean. That is, for those interested in this kind of thing, I can't remember the name of the article off the top of my head, but it's Peregrine Horden who wrote co-wrote the big massive work on the Mediterranean. He has this smaller article on dragons as dragons and disease, and the ways that Episcopal saints get linked to. It's a very cool argument, actually, the ways that Episcopal saints get linked to dragons, because Episcopal saints are the ones doing waterworks in the early Middle Ages, and so they're the ones potentially dealing with river construction and river management, and also public health infrastructure, things that we would consider public health. And so they drive out the dragons of pestilence. It's very cool. And so this is trans-European, I think, and I'm focusing on this one region, but I think that you're right, it's an important reminder that some of these myths become bigger than just a region. There are some that I'm discovering that do seem to be regional. There's one that I'm spending a whole chunk of the book on that is this really strange set of river stories in which they only appear to be in sort of the Rhine-Mosel region with a couple of outliers, but the Rhine-Mosel tributary region, where saints get in boats, whether living or dead, often the saints are dead, and they float upstream. And there's this strange little constellation of stories. There's about 30 of them. But I can't really find them outside of the Rhine-Mosel region. But these dragon saint stories are kind of all over the place. It's St. Patrick and the snakes, the Rome, the great pestilence of Rome, and the Archangel Michael. It's just kind of, yeah, I think dragons are kind of universal. What people choose to do with them is what makes it kind of potentially regional. And this one, in fact, the Graioui lasts into the early modern. And in fact, in some ways, the Graioui becomes more, even though it's clearly part of St. Clement and part of this medieval voice, it's early modern tie with Pantagruel and Rabelais and like early modern civic spectacle. Like, it becomes more of an early modern dragon than a medieval dragon in the end. So. And that's where it becomes Metz's, I think, back to Will's question. Like that, it's in the civic parade. It's in the early modern ways in which this story becomes about Metz and Metz civics and the optics. One of the images I showed is from a broadsheet where it then outlays the order in which all of the different guilds and town officers go in the parade. And so this way of trying to like make legible the urban hierarchies and stuff, it becomes a very early medieval Metz thing in a way that St. Clement never really was, which is really interesting to me, at least. Thank you guys all for being here. I realize we've hit the hour.
I was just thinking, Alan, the link you just made between the bishops which were fighting the dragons and controlling, were in the same period between the 10th and the 12th, 13th century. They were controlling the rivers, they were organizing the rivers. I think that's an important, as the control of rivers, especially in an urban context, it's so closely connected to the kind of the origins and the memory of the urban origins also. I think that's an important element to explain why these stories become so central not only in a sort of monastic world, but also it's also urban legends and in the urban imagination. I was thinking about, but no, you don't see it. It's André Guillermo's Age of Water, in which he, from the 300 to 1800, the urban environment in the north of France, and he really focuses for this early period on this all kind of infrastructures which make use of running water, and their centrality in the origins in this early development of cities also. So I think that's a very interesting thing to explore, to cross with your narrative.
Yeah. And Will sent me a follow-up note about this hinterland idea, and I think that Guillaume does this really well. But I think one of the important things too to remember is it's not just the Mosel and the Rhine and the Danube and that matter for like river history. And I think that's one of the interesting things, and one of the reasons that these big cities don't necessarily get to be the stars of my work is that what we see in the narrative sources, that it's all the small rivers everywhere through Gaul, like this whole area of Germany, France, the Low Countries. They're just overflowing with tiny little rivers that become the work engines of agriculture, not only for trade, but also, as you point out, like for just energy and work and mills, and it's the big rivers are what we pay attention to as moderns. But it's all the everyday rivers that kind of make it into the stories that survive from the medieval tellers.
The river as the workhorse of the Middle Ages. Yeah. Okay, thank you very much.
Horsefish.
Yeah, the horsefish indeed. Thank you very much, Ellen. This was a very pleasant and a very inspiring presentation, and good luck with your research. Good luck also with the move to Norway.
Thank you.
And keep well. All of you also, thanks for being here, and hope to see you on a future occasion. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.